Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today for our fourth of four and our fourth and final Colorado Water Plan listening session. This one's around environment and recreation, and we're really excited to have this. In many ways, the thoughts behind this session and maybe some in the agriculture as well was the genesis of recognizing that it was really time to maybe jumpstart this public dialogue in addition to the work that we're doing, the roundtables, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. Just as order of kind of a little bit on process today, we'll do as brief as we can keep it, 20 to 30 minute intro presentation that really talks about our process moving forward. And that's so critical. It's something that we heard from stakeholders as we're reaching out to roundtables and talking about what we're doing, just making sure that the entire water community understands where we're at in the process and specifically understands where there are opportunities and the kind of timeframes for providing input on the water plan update and maybe even feeding into the basin implementation plan discussions. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. Sam, if you want to click to the next slide. So one quick note here, just I've said this every meeting, but I think it's so important. There's a lot going on in the world right now. I know that we are all dealing with things in our own ways, and I am just very grateful to have such an engaged water community. We've had, I think I was saying, somewhere around 300 people signing up to attend these listening sessions, and maybe 250 or so actually making each meeting. So much so that we've had to offer an additional option to stream on YouTube so that we can accommodate everyone that wants to listen. This is really the place where I think we start that conversation that builds on the legacy the water plan started, to really be collaborative and to find that common ground. And I think and I hope that's what we're all striving for, and I know that's what we're going to get. So as I noted, this is going to be streaming live on YouTube. On YouTube, we have disabled the chat function. So if you have questions there, we will be monitoring questions that come in, but they will need to come into that waterplan.info@state.co.us website or email, and you can send those questions or comments as you like. If you are logged in via GoToMeeting today, you can click that little chat bubble and the chat will pop up and you're welcome to, and we are inviting you to, and hopefully you will put comments and questions there, especially as we'll be using those to kind of seed some of the board discussion. This may be an audio test. I'm seeing in the chat a question on audio feedback. If anyone else is hearing that, please chat, let me know. A quick note on the facilitation team today. They've been here, kind of the staunch group here through all four of these, but myself, the section chief for the water supply planning section, Russ Sands, deputy section chief, Kat Weissmiller, and program manager, Sam Stein. And I would just be remiss not to note that these are the faces and names you're hearing today, but clearly this is a full CWCB effort, and we are all engaged and working as a team on the water plan. So just because you may not be seeing names or faces, please know this is really a full team CWCB effort. Helping us on that team is Matt Lindbergh, who's been project manager, not just for this effort to update the BIPs and the water plan, but we're really fortunate that Matt and the bulk of his team were the same consultant team that worked on the analysis and technical update to the water plan. So the kind of data backbone that is driving things forward for us. And same with Matt, that is the face and name you'll see today, but he has a great team of subcontractors working with him. And then at the basin level, Matt is also helping to oversee what we're calling local experts or subcontractors that are working with each basin. Next slide. Quick ground rules. We will be muting. I know we've muted if we're hearing some, we had a little bit of music, elevator music yesterday going on in the background. So we'll be hitting mute on that if we hear it. Cameras are disabled except for the panelists, just in case that's a question that comes up. As noted, please take advantage of using the chat. We would really appreciate having some thoughtful comments or questions there. If you can keep those respectful, and remember, the intent of today is not to put anyone on the spot. Certainly when it comes to questions that are more pointed of, will the water plan update do X? I mean, the point of these sessions is really to help define what we are fully doing. We have a really good framework moving forward that I'll talk about how that's really been informed by stakeholders from across the state. But, it's time to start fleshing that out and getting the detail. And these listening sessions are really a way to help get public, especially those that might be not as consistently going to roundtables or involved with roundtables, to make sure that they are at least having this first opportunity, certainly not the last, but first foray into kind of making their voice heard. So this is all about exploring ideas today, and I think you might have heard this at the beginning, but we are recording both this GoToMeeting and on YouTube. Next slide. So I will just frame up, and I'm reminded that a few of you, maybe more than a few of you, I'm so grateful. I didn't really expect that, but a lot of you may have gone to multiple listening sessions, and if you have, we're teeing up this background, and so you'll get a double or triple or maybe a quadruple dose of this. But it's really important to just understand the genesis of how we got to where we're at, how it's framed our thinking, and how that thinking has really been shaped by our stakeholders, including many of you that are on the phone right now and on this webinar. In 2010, the statewide water supply initiative came out, and that was before there was a water plan. We were working on water plan-like concepts, and that was really framed up in the statewide water supply initiative, largely built around data. In 2014, we really started working to really draft up the water plan and have basins work on the basin implementation plans. And this idea that these three things are really part of a whole started to become increasingly clear to us. You have the technical piece, and then you have the basin plans and the projects certainly that are in those being so critical. And then the kind of all rolled up in and adding the policy piece in the water plan itself. In 2017, we took a crack at kind of doing what I may affectionately call a scorecard, if you will, in a document we called Ripple Effects that just looked at progress made on the water plan to date. And we identified that progress was being made on over 65% of the actions in the water plan, not necessarily saying that those are complete, but that we're moving those forward. And certainly that effort is something that you are all sharing and helping us move forward. Another thing that came out of that was maybe a bit of a recognition that the Ripple Effects document was a little bit thinner. It was about 70-page document compared to the water plan. And it also really helped us as we're kind of drafting up a scorecard of what we've done, of just helping almost highlight a little bit more, if it wasn't already clear in the water plan, some of the data that would be forthcoming, that we just needed to get a better handle and really refine data. And that data push, the push to get better data is certainly a theme that is carrying forward. Also in 2017, we had the technical advisory groups as we were looking to develop the next phase, what was then going to be teed up as the statewide water supply initiative, the next phase of that effort. There had been some pretty significant changes. In the water plan, we have these 5 future scenarios, these 5 variant futures of what may happen, variant levels of climate change or population growth, water use across different sectors. That it was going to need a different approach to looking at those across those scenarios. And we were also trying to address some of the comments we heard of how we could just make things better. And we had members from each basin, some that are on this call, some that are on the panel, provide input on that process. And so those tags really helped provide some of that initial framing of what the methodology would be. In 2018, we did a roundtable roadshow where we went around to each roundtable, in many cases, multiple times. And it was as much about saying where we're at in the process with developing the next steps as it was about collecting input on how we could make the process more seamless moving forward. And in the end of 2018 and moving through 2019, we put together a small stakeholder group that was made up of 3 members from each basin that we called the Implementation Working Group. That was largely basin roundtable members. Some were also from IBCC, and they helped us kind of frame up the ideas and the feedback that we gotten from roundtables, some ideas that staff had of what we almost inherently had to look at, this question around better project data being one, and really shape that into a set of recommendations of what a BIP update and by proxy the water plan update should look like. And that is all codified in section 5 of the technical update. And I might just pause there to say, for those who are maybe seeing a gap in terminology, that thought process that all these pieces come together in a whole really had us reframing what we call the Statewide Water Supply Initiative, or SWASI, in light of the water plan, realizing it was connected more. And part of the feedback we got from stakeholders, even in helping advocate for or explain what this document was, had us rebranding this as the analysis and technical update to the Colorado Water Plan, really just recognizing that this is the technical data backbone of the water plan update, and certainly is feeding into the BIP updates. And I would just note that that section 5 that kind of maps that out got 100% consensus on moving forward from that implementation working group. Next slide. A few key pieces that came out of those discussions across the basins and the implementation working group were really the process that we have. This idea that we want to keep basin funding whole. We don't want to do what we did with the first BIPs and make it a grant-making process that uses basin account funds, uses those water supply reserve fund accounts to pull money to pay for this update. We also recognize that we probably want help or volunteer board doing this, and how can we kind of make both of those things a reality? And so I'm very grateful, especially now with in light of current budget situation, that our board first approved and then the legislature approved funding to move the BIP and water plan update effort forward. As we did that, we struck a different approach, again, with just how we would manage that process and better support the roundtables by having this general contractor, local expert, or really a prime sub relationship with subcontractors working in each basin, really being that key liaison point person with the roundtables, addressing and really understanding and working in those communities, understanding the needs that they had. And that is a key part of the process moving forward. 3 big pieces that came out of that in terms of feedback. And if you look at that chapter 5, I mentioned there's a lot of detail there, but if I could really sum it up into 3 key points, it's we need to streamline this process. Surely there's a way to do this, these updates in a quicker, smarter, cheaper, more efficient way. Does it always have to be such a heavy lift? How can we better utilize technology? Can we make shorter strategy type documents, or do they always have to be such a weighty document? Can we, if we have shorter documents, can we use those to better engage stakeholders or new roundtable members or students? Another clear mandate was to really focus on projects. Again, whether it was not trying to take from money that might otherwise be used to implement projects. That implementation was key, but also I think a fundamental realization that to support project costs, in a basin, that we have to have better costing information and better yield information and know where the project lives. And in many cases, that full data set isn't there. So really understanding that we need to focus on projects, that is the key moving forward. But to do that, there's an inherent commitment that we're going to get better data. And last, to just really unpack the methodology. There's any number of comments, especially with SWASI 2010, that highlighted just not understanding how the methodology was done. And we really wanted to give more access, more transparency into that process. I mean, there's really nothing to hide. In many ways, we've really done a state-of-the-art analysis, but it's complicated. And I think giving that due diligence to let stakeholders understand how decisions were being made is key to just making sure that buy-in is there, and where there are the opportunities to enhance, especially the data that can strengthen the report outs and the outputs of modeling. We certainly want to do that. Next slide. So these are the 3 pieces of the whole I mentioned. The analysis and technical update came out at the end of 2019. You can find that online on the Water Plan website. There is a volume 1 and a more lengthy volume 2 you can dig into as much as you want. Volume 2 has a lot of the technical memorandums, some isolated case studies, where volume 1 is kind of the more compact version and outputs of all of the data. Now we are moving into the basin implementation plan phase, and this is a process that's set to wrap up at the end of 2021. These basin implementation plan updates are something the roundtables are actively working on, and Matt's going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. And this all converges and rolls up into the water plan update, which is set to be completed by the end of 2022. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about phases, and again, just really trying to honor stakeholder feedback that we heard of. I want to understand this process a little bit better. I want to know where the opportunities are for me to have my voice be heard, to influencing decisions, to understand what the opportunities are. And so instead of showing a Gantt chart or something that breaks things out by month, I think it's better just to kind of divide this up into what I see as buckets of kind of time, with that first bucket of time being the work that starts, now or yesterday, that goes through the end of this year. And so that work going through Q4. Sam, do we need to do a mute all? So that work that goes through the end of this year is really focused around the decisions that impact scope, modeling, studies, goals, and objectives. This is framed up in the context of the basin plan, but as you'll see, this all wraps together and times with the water plan update itself. And so certainly this is true for the water plan too. We basically need to know if there are any major data changes or tweaks on methodology or special studies that we're going to line up by near the end of this year so that we can actually have the time to execute and do the modeling and have the outputs. So that's really this first line of work. The second line is again, I kind of see it as tracking the same. It maybe starts today, but it has a longer runtime and it goes through, maybe this time next year. So about a year out, we're looking to really have better detail on the decisions that impact projects and really having that project data run to ground and really a better idea of strategies and metrics. And then there's a third phase at least with tracking with the BIP specifically, that is kind of that final wrap up. Now we're, we've probably been drafting text throughout this process, but we're really looking at refining that. And then for the water plan, kind of looking at starting to get that first draft of text in. And so now you'll see how that wraps up into the full water plan with that going through 2022. And of course, we will absolutely have that draft document out online, just like the first water plan, where there's plenty of time for public comment. What's different maybe, and what I think stakeholders have really clearly asked us for, is not to wait till that draft's out. We're listening, we're hearing you, and part of this, the reason we're doing this session and the others, is to let that public comment process start now to help give some insight into the opportunity and not just react to a draft, but hopefully have some voice in seeing where that's at along the way and helping shape it. So that draft will be out in 2022, but and we will wrap up by the end of the year. But I think it's important to also stress that the work doesn't end there. And certainly, Sam, if you can click one more time, please. You'll see that there's also a concurrent state effort. I'd be remiss not to say that staff have been putting in a ton of time to really dig in and say, where do they think we can enhance the water plan? Where are the opportunities that we might be able to strengthen our relations with other partner agencies and reaching out to them? So there's kind of three kind of concurrent efforts that are tracking together. And again, I think the big point here is that just because a draft is done doesn't mean the work stops. We are really trying to embrace the intent of the water plan to be a living document. And as a living document, it's incumbent upon us to find ways to kind of make that more dynamic and easily accessible. And so the concept of doing like a project database is something that we are concurrently working on, so that if in the past we'd have a BIP update done, or we'd have the BIP done, we'd have a water plan done, and you've got this somewhat static project list sitting there that new project comes online and now the document's instantly outdated. By kind of separating out those things a little bit and having an online database, we'll have the ability to have project data be updated, to have new projects come online. It could be updated every month. It could be reprioritized if a basin decides that their priorities have shifted because of some major event or something changing, or maybe roundtable makeup shifting, for example. So we're trying to really look at this process moving forward of how much of this can we continue to make more living, more active, move as much as we can maybe into more online formats, but still retain that kind of key document. And Matt's going to talk a little bit about what that might look like next.
Okay. Thanks, Russ. I'll visit for a few minutes here about the process we're using to update the BIPs and the water plan. We've sort of just started down that timeline that Russ described in his last slide, and our focus has primarily been on the BIP update process. One of the first things that we have been doing is working with each roundtable to help them identify and hire on as a sub-consultant to Brown and Caldwell, a local expert that they want to work with that's going to help those roundtables update their basin implementation plans. An initial task that we conducted with those local experts was to have a workshop in which we downloaded basically the information from the technical update, our approaches, our assumptions, and equip those local experts to work with their roundtables to interpret the information that was developed during the technical update to the water plan and help them update their BIPs. An initial focus for those local experts has been in two areas. One, looking at the project lists that each of those basin roundtables developed during their original BIP. Some have continued to manage those lists, but updating those lists with information on new projects, projects that maybe are no longer being pursued, identifying cost data. So really prioritizing those project lists, which was something that the roundtables said during that implementation working group process that Russ described. They said they wanted some focus on that. So that's one area. Another area is that the local experts are working with roundtables to develop BIP update work plans. And those are really a scope of work for each roundtable to conduct their BIP updates. So what kinds of discussions are they going to have at the local level regarding their strategies and regarding their actions? What kinds of additional analyses may they want to pursue? So really kind of outlining those BIPs. So the local expert workshops, again, Sam, if you wouldn't mind advancing the slide. There was a lot of interest from across the state in participating in these local expert workshops, but we wanted to really keep those in a smaller venue to allow us to take the time to really dig into the details on what was done during the technical update and to provide an environment that folks feel comfortable asking all kinds of questions. Maybe they would feel it was a dumb question. There were no dumb questions, but providing that environment. If you're curious about what was done during the technical update to the water plan, you can go to the CWCB's website. There's a web page focused on the water plan. You can find some technical webinars that were recorded during the course of the technical update project. Those technical webinars describe things like how we calculated ag demands and how we calculated municipal demands and the gap, and discussed environmental and rec issues. And so you're welcome to review those. I'll mention these listening sessions will also be added to that website when they're ready to go. So back to the local expert workshops, we not only focused on the methodologies, but we also dug into some of the tools that were developed. There's a flow tool that we looked at and did some tutorials on and really dug into. And that flow tool is going to give roundtables the ability to look at potential future risks to environmental and rec attributes under the 5 planning scenarios associated with the water plan. We also looked at a project costing tool that was developed to let roundtables develop some ballpark costs for projects that don't have cost information already. And so we dug into those items, and we also talked about some sideboards, which are really topics of roundtable and statewide interest that we want to proceed with caution as we consider those in the basin implementation plans and the water plan. So what are some examples of those? First of all, topics that have their own concurrent process outside of the update. So demand management is a good example. The CWCB board and staff are running a process already that's funded with a different bucket of money that is incorporating a lot of stakeholders from across the state. They're looking at a wide variety of issues associated with demand management. And we wouldn't necessarily want a BIP to do some sort of detailed analysis of demand management that may differ from what this other process is developing. Not that the BIP or the water plan are going to be silent on these issues, but we need to think carefully about how we talk about those. Things that don't have a clearly established methodology. So an environmental and rec gap calculation may be an example of that. We have, as I mentioned, the flow tool that allows folks to look at potential future risks to environmental and rec attributes, but that's not the same, precisely the same calculation that we conducted for in municipal gaps and agricultural gaps. So if there's interest in doing some sort of a environmental and rec gap calculation, we'd like to have a statewide conversation about what that methodology may look like. And then perhaps that would be something then that would be an action item in the water plan. And so then things that may create legal conflicts, looking at the effects of a compact call on the Colorado River may be a good example of that. So Kevin Ryan has been doing a good job talking to different venues, different folks about the uncertainties and unknowns associated with what might happen if a compact call were to ever be implemented. And we wouldn't want a specific BIP or maybe a set of series of BIPs to look at a detailed evaluation of what might happen under a compact call if we don't really know what will really happen. So we want to avoid those kinds of potential contradictory analyses. So we're going to be thinking about these in the BIPs. We'll also be thinking about them in the water plan itself. And just to give you a little update there, we have started the water plan update process with a couple of kickoff meetings with CWCB staff. And moving forward with 3 concurrent efforts. The first is led by the CWCB, but working with other state agencies, other federal agencies to identify areas where the water plan can be enhanced and updated. Of course, the BIPs that the roundtables are working on are going to be foundational information for the water plan. And we also are going to be working with stakeholders statewide to identify areas where the water plan can be updated and enhanced, and just have this little representation of that timeline that Russ presented earlier as a reminder that there'll be opportunities for input at every stage of the process. And in fact, today is a good example of that. So a lot of the feedback that Russ described from the implementation working group discussions not only apply to the BIPs, but also applies to the water plan. And I'll give you one example of how that is being considered in the water plan. Some of the feedback was that we want to make these plans and documents much more easily updated and more consumable. And so what we're intending to do for the BIPs, but also the water plan, is to separate those into 2 separate documents, but obviously with a lot of overlap and relation. So the first would be strategy-focused volume 1, and it would be a shorter document. It would be very focused on actions. What are our challenges and strategies to meet those challenges? Goals and measurable outcomes, actions, things that would be updated when you update your BIP or update the water plan. And then the second volume would be more of reference information. So what's the background of the water plan? What's our legal setting for how we administer water or our interstate compacts? How is water generally used? What are our descriptions of our various basins? Things that don't change and things that we don't necessarily need to update and repeat every time we update the base implementation plans of the water plans. So to do all of this, we know we need to talk to a lot of different folks. And as we're doing that, we're going to be looking for different synergies. So as the basins are updating their basin implementation plans, what are some common themes in those basin implementation plans, and how can the water plan help advance those themes and the basin goals? As we talk with other state agencies, what water-related activities are they conducting, and how can the water plan enhance those, and vice versa? As we talk to other stakeholders from around the state, what activities are they engaged in, and how can the water plan help them, and what are some synergies among the things that various stakeholders are doing? And then also keeping an eye on the original water plan. There was a lot of good work that went into that, a lot of good collaboration. We don't want to throw that out. This is an update to that plan. So we're going to be considering all these things. We may not be able to incorporate everything we hear because, for example, there may be a stakeholder that's working on a study that is not going to be done for 6 months after the water plan is developed. We can't change our timeline, but perhaps we could include a reference to that study. But obviously, we're going to want to maximize the size of that bubble on that graphic and incorporate all the input that we can. So in that spirit of finding synergies and gathering feedback, I'm going to turn it over to Russ to initiate our panel discussion.
Thanks, Matt. And I see some questions already coming in the chat. We will hold those until after we get through the panel discussion. As you have probably all or most of you, it seems like you have tuned into a few of these. I just want to thank again, not just our panelists from today for being here, but all the panelists on each of these listening sessions. It's really created some great discussion, and to all of you that are starting to populate the chat. I will go ahead and turn things over to our panel now. And with the process, I think we're going to go through, just to save a little time, is ask each of you to kind of introduce yourself and talk about your background, and then really dive into your hopes and aspirations for the water plan update. So Abby, thanks for jumping in there, and I will turn things over to you first.
Great. Thanks, Russ and Matt, and the entire CWCB team for pulling this webinar series together, and certainly thanks to our co-panelists, and thanks to the folks listening in and participating today. It looks like a pretty great turnout. My name is Abby Burke. I'm the Western Rivers Regional Program Manager for Audubon Rockies, and Audubon Rockies is a regional office of the National Audubon Society, and our region covers Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And my work predominantly focuses on Colorado, but I also work around Upper Basin Colorado River issues. My water plan story started in 2014 as a South Platte Basin resident, and I participated there in the Basin Roundtable. And now, as the plan's entering its first update, I'm a resident of the Colorado Basin, and so I now participate with the Colorado Basin Roundtable. So my work allows me to interact with multiple basin roundtables, and it gives me an appreciation of the local needs and the values and water culture of several different basins. And so my thoughts on the environmental and recreational water plan update today are kind of averaged around more of a statewide level. And just for a little bit of background, Audubon is invested in healthy rivers and wetlands for birds and people. And, birds and waterfowl depend on rivers, riparian areas and wetlands. And in Colorado and much of the Intermountain West, more than 80% of all wildlife species depend on these wetland and riparian habitats at some portion of their life cycle. And these habitats rely on water levels and water quantity. So these habitats are very responsive to drought, to dams, to groundwater depletion, and certainly water management activities. And, we are dependent on these freshwater habitats too for clean drinking water, irrigation, water recreation, and so much more. So as changes to our hydrology and changes in demographics and water use and a growing population, Colorado absolutely needs a responsive and actionable water plan for protecting our state's brand, or what makes us so unique. And, to me, arguably, it's our rivers and all they support, what makes our state so special. And so the water plan and the Basin Roundtable structure offer a good platform and an interface or a venue to collaborate and engage on water issues and solutions around the state. And with our strong dependency on river health for water supplies, environmentally and consumptively, personally, I'd like to see a more robust support structure for the environment at the Basin Roundtable level, particularly as I kind of reflect on from moving through the water plan's creation to now its update. We've had roughly 50% of Basin Roundtable turnover in their memberships. And so just a thought around that. But I find one of the most useful results of the water plan are certainly the actionable goals and objectives. These goals and action items for both people and the environment provide deadlines to achieve much needed activity to move Colorado forward toward a more sustainable water future. And, one of our largest challenges, certainly in Colorado and across the West, is just the uncertainty and challenges in hydrology and the changes in hydrology that we are seeing. Due to climate change, we're seeing extremes, both booms and busts in our snowpack. We're seeing earlier melt and runoff in hotter summers and falls with longer growing seasons. And so rivers are vulnerable to these changes, and so are we. So I have a couple of hopes, going forward as, we move into this update process. And, Matt kind of touched on the first that I like to talk about is I really feel that an environmental gap analysis needs to be an action item within the water plan's update. I know it can be very complicated to perform such a large, endeavor, especially with climate change and kind of departures from our natural flow regimes, and then certainly a $3 billion budget shortfall this year and possibly in years to come. But a solid baseline of river health and flow data are truly needed. And rivers are looking at also, more than just an environmental flow gap. River stress can come from a variety of sources, from quality and quantity. So if an environmental gap analysis isn't possible, then perhaps a rapid river health assessment might be reachable. And for some folks that might meet a new term, a rapid river health assessment kind of gives a broad picture of river health and stressors to focus future projects around, and stream management plan potential creation and implementation, around some durable solutions for on the ground improved management of our rivers. But bottom line, I hope we move towards more of a data, acquisition with this update, around river flows and health, and for riparian and wetland areas. And I hope to see basin roundtables kind of prioritize this increase in data in their updates. And potentially, historically, gap analysis or river health analysis kind of requires grant structures and grant processes. And those grants can require a 50% match to go forward. And, potentially as we're looking at ways to see the water plan process move forward in a successful update, potentially could there be a reduced match requirement for these kind of data inquiries to see if we could kind of move this forward. And that might even be some sort of a form of a kind of a stimulus to go forward. But I feel that, we have great value when we invest in our rivers, and all water users and uses benefit from healthy flowing rivers. We can't adequately prioritize projects and support rivers without knowing baseline information for evaluation. Plus, this can provide a pipeline for projects and local stream management plan efforts. And so kind of a second hope that I have going forward into this update process is looking at how we could potentially weave environmental resilience to climate change into this update at both the basin and the state levels. And in this same light, I hope that basins prioritize projects in forwarding green or natural infrastructure projects and process-based river restoration practices. We depend on the ecological services provided by wetlands and riverscapes, and hand in hand here, healthy flowing rivers and waterways are big business for Colorado. In Colorado alone, Business for Water Stewardship just released a report that details how statewide water-based recreation generates $18.8 billion annually and supports more than 131,000 jobs. And that's just looking at recreation and recreation-related activities around our water. And so that's a significant economic impact. And ultimately, we are connected by water flowing in these rivers, both people and nature. And when we support healthy Colorado rivers, we all thrive with this. And my last hope, and I know I've used up my time here, but my last hope is with this update is that we robustly engage the public and the media around this update. And I know this webinar series is a great way to start this process off But we have so many newcomers to our state that have different water values or different levels of appreciation for water. And particularly in Colorado, it's one of our most precious natural resources. And so I'm hoping that this water plan update is a spot where we can engage and galvanize the public around Colorado's water future and let that be an education touch point going forward. So, so Russ, with that, I'll conclude my thoughts there.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your comments, Abby, and thanks again for being here. I think we will go to our next panelist. So I'm going to call on Aaron Sachon. If you could give us your thoughts and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you all see and hear me?
We can.
Great. So my name's Aaron Citron. I'm the Acting Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy here in Colorado. For those of you who don't know, the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We have a presence in all 50 states and 79 countries. And one of our focal strategies, as I mentioned, is the protection of lands, freshwater resources, and oceans. And we have been engaged in water in Colorado for nearly 50 years and engaged in the development of the water plan and continue to be engaged in furthering the science and the policies around its implementation. So I want to start just by pointing out that water supply issues in Colorado and frankly in the West are one of the biggest problems that nobody outside of maybe a few wonks, and I'm happy to see there's I'm seeing 135 people here and probably more on YouTube, but the broader community doesn't really recognize the scope of this issue. And I do want to commend the state for putting together this water plan and trying to kind of preach the gospel of water and its implications for all residents through this series. It's also a very fixable problem. It's probably the cheapest problem that we have in Colorado is addressing and implementing the strategies identified in the water plan. It's been estimated that it would cost us about $100 million a year. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But when you compare it to other needs related to education and healthcare, et cetera, it's relatively small. That said, we're obviously in a fiscal crisis here in Colorado. I'm not suggesting we're going to find $100 million in the couch cushions, but it is something that we can strive towards, is identifying ways to invest in this before our water resource challenges get any worse. And people's opinions on this are literally swayed by the weather. We had some great snow early in the season, as you all know, and probably enjoyed. And now our basin snowpack is getting precipitously low. So somebody's opinion on this, if you hit them on the right day, is I skied great yesterday. I boated yesterday. Everything's fine. To fires are burning and the rivers are dry, and now we want to act. So it's a tough one to get people particularly focused and excited about. A few things that I wanted to focus on very quickly were also that this issue, rivers and water supply, are inherently not bounded at our state borders. And everything we're doing in Colorado is great. I commend the Water Conservation Board and others for doing this robust planning. But we can't limit our thinking to what's happening in Colorado. Everything we do here really impacts downstream states, and actions downstream in many ways do impact us as well. So we need to continue to lead by example and make sure that the solutions that we're crafting cross state boundaries, cross international boundaries, at least here with the connections to Mexico in the Colorado River Basin. So I will run through a couple of my hopes for the next phase of the water plan, the next version. And a lot of these were touched on by Abby and in the presentations we've heard so far. I am very happy to see the environment with its own session and being considered as part of the planning process. And I think that we can go even farther in looking at environmental values as a co-equal player in the water story in Colorado. The water plan currently includes a essentially a planning goal when we think about environmental needs. The goal talks about a need for stream management plans on 80% of our locally prioritized streams and rivers, I think. And that's excellent. Planning is critical, and we do need to understand at a granular level the needs in these various basins. I do agree with what Abby has said and what was mentioned earlier, that a statewide assessment is also really, really necessary. And I'd also love to focus on a transition from transition to implementation from a narrow focus on planning. We shouldn't give up the planning and the identification of needs in these basins, but we also have to find ways to implement the strategies and the projects identified in the stream management plans. We also I'd like for us to think a little bit more about the connections between water quantity and water quality. There's an assumption, I'd say, that the water that we're accounting for in these models is of an appropriate quality for the needs to which it's going to be put. And in Colorado, we generally, as a headwater state, water quality is not top of mind for many people. And we're lucky for that, but it shouldn't be ignored. And not that the water plan ignores it, but I'd love to see greater collaboration and coordination between water quality agencies, working with CDPHE and others to make sure that our rivers are not just flowing, but healthy, and that waters are of the appropriate quality for people to drink, for fish, for recreation, etc. So I'd also just reinforce what I mentioned before about implementation, that I sometimes hear a lot about the focus on multi-purpose projects and that being a kind of an environmental benefit, and it absolutely is, but it's a benefit across the board. With limited resources, both water and financial resources, we should be focusing on every project having multiple benefits, but that is obviously not enough for the environment. And we should be thinking also about not just how to avoid harms, but how to uplift and return our environment as much as possible to a state that is healthier, of course, in concert and in balance with the human needs that we all rely on because we live here in the state of Colorado. So the elements that have been useful in the plan, the funding that's being made available through the water plan grant programs really is invaluable and is something that the environmental community, and I'd like to think all of the water using communities, have begun to rely upon, and we certainly hope that those are maintained into the future. And I will repeat what you've heard from Abby and kind of what I heard as a question from Matt Lindbergh, that I would like to see a better data set so that we can compare environmental needs, the environmental gaps, in an apples-to-apples way with the agricultural gaps, the municipal gaps. I think that'll allow for a more robust conversation statewide about the direction we want to go. And other than that, if we can build that data, and if we can continue both thinking locally in Colorado, but ensuring that what we're doing here is well connected to the work that's happening in separate forums with our demand management conversations and with other states, that's a challenge, but also an opportunity, and something that I think should be integrated into the next water plan in a more direct way, to think about we're planning for water supplies, and obviously what happens with the Colorado River, what happens with all of our interstate rivers affects all water users, certainly including the environment. So again, I'm really appreciative of the opportunity here, looking forward to hearing some questions, and I think I will leave it there. So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Really appreciate your time. Speaking of questions, I just saw another one come in, but please keep those coming. If you're hearing something that you have a thought on, please put those thoughts, ideas, questions, comments in the chat. And maybe for any late joiners, if you are listening through YouTube, you will not have that option to use the chat, but you can email waterplan.info@state.co.us and send us, and we will be kind of monitoring those emails as they come in. For those on GoToMeeting, feel free to use the chat. And I will turn it over to our next panelist. Carrie, thanks for popping up on the camera there. Take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Russ, and thanks to CWCB and Caldwell and everyone that helped put this together. I think this is a really critical and important step toward digging into the data that's going to build out the next level of the water plan. And a little bit about myself, I work for Unlimited, the conservation organization. We protect, reconnect, restore America's cold water fisheries, and that, in a nutshell, is making fishing better. That's our goal. I work in the Gunnison Basin, primarily on agricultural water projects. I've been a member of the Gunnison Basin Roundtable since 2007, when I was a representative for Uray County, and I'm now in the environmental seat on the roundtable. A few things that I want to touch on that I think that Aaron and Abby both touched on was the importance of gathering information to hone in on the gaps and the priority reaches that we have in the state so that we can create better projects. I really believe that these types of activities, this outreach is critical to doing that. The more we draw in information from not only the water community, but water users across the state of all colors and shapes and sectors, the better suited we're going to be to creating a better water plan, but also creating better projects. I think my hopes for this next section of the water plan, this next section of the water planning effort, is that we build on and use the technical data that we have, but also use the tools that we've created, including the flow tool that Matt Lindbergh talked about earlier, to not only address our environmental and recreation needs, but also to understand how those environmental and recreation needs overlap with the needs of other water sources so that we can identify where projects are, how we can address those gaps, and how we can move those projects forward in a win-win fashion. In doing that, in the past, we've been a part of a few stream management planning processes in the state. And one thing that's taught us is sitting down at the table with agricultural water users especially has helped develop good projects that can be win-win and can have those multi-benefit projects. That's not to say that in the future we won't have projects that aren't multi-purpose. Obviously, there's going to be standalone environmental and recreation projects, but the more data and the more information that we can put into this planning process that helps us define where our gaps are and how those interact with other water users, we are going to be able to create better projects. I would say the other part about the outreach component is looking back at where we've been is going to be important in creating the new section of the water planning process and the water plan updates. I think we've spent a lot of money on projects in the past, and it's going to be important to look back at those projects, learn from those, where was the money spent, what water gap was addressed, what problems did we have to overcome, and what can inform future projects. I think that's going to be a critical and important part of not just meeting our future water supply needs, but also about how we can spend money the most efficient way to meet these gaps. So I hope that is part of this outreach process, is reaching out to those people who have been involved in the water planning process, but also have been project proponents or have spent money on and put money on the ground to meet water gaps and find out what happened. So as we move forward, I hope that we can continue to quantify our gaps. And there are places in the state where we have done a good job of quantifying water needs. And I think Linda Bassey's on this call. She from the CWCB. They've done a good job of identifying where we need water and the amounts of water that we need, but also digging into a little bit about the nuance of when that water needs to be there, in what amounts, the quantity, the quality, the temperature issues that we might be facing as we face a warming climate with a changing flow regime, and then we can start to develop those plans about how we can best overcome those obstacles. We can start to gather that data in a number of ways. As Abby mentioned, those rapid assessments might be the right tool in some places, maybe just reaching out to water users in some places. They have information, but it's not compiled. And then there's obviously going to be places in this state where we don't have a lot of data, and that's where we're going to have the heavy lift of trying to figure that out. And hopefully that's where we can start to apply new stream management plans, new processes where we dig into the data and find out what we really need to do. In closing, I just want to say that I'm hoping that this next round of water planning efforts builds on the data that we have, finds the data that we need to create better projects, refines our project lists, uses those priority tools that the CWCB and consultants have created. Use tools like the flow tool, not just for environmental and rec needs, but also overlaps with other water uses like agriculture and municipal uses. And then creates better projects that we can point at as an education tool so that we can learn from what we've done and continue the outreach and continue bringing people together to create better projects. That's all I have, Russ.
Thanks so much, Gary. Really appreciate it. Good thoughts. Next up, we're going to have Linda Bassey with CWCB. Linda?
Good morning. I'm Linda Bassey. I'm Chief of the Stream and Lake Protection Section at the CWCB. The section is a team of 8 people who implement the state's in-stream flow and natural lake level program and work on water rights that are held on behalf of the people of the state. So I'm going to talk about my hopes for this water plan update. Overall, I'm hoping that the tools and the information provided in the update are going to inspire the roundtables and give them what they need as they move forward on updating the basin implementation plans. Also, there's a lot of great work happening on stream management plans and integrated water management plans around the state. And I think that this update can really help generate more plans and add to the plans that are ongoing. I'm excited about the environmental and recreational flow tool. I think it can really help inform the roundtables on deciding which projects to move forward, particularly environmental and recreational projects, but as Carrie said, also to use the tool to evaluate the other types of projects they're working on for impacts and risks to the environment, and to find ways for those projects to move forward while sustaining the environment, providing recreational opportunities, and ideally building in some flexibility to address the impacts of climate change. So the in-stream flow program team at CWCB has always hoped that our program could help the roundtables meet their environmental needs and to help with the environmental aspects of projects, whether through a new in-stream flow water right or through the in-stream flow acquisition program. We have creative and flexible tools for partnering with water users on different types of projects and on protecting flows. And we really hope to be able to work with stakeholders on that type of work. and on using those tools successfully. So we hope that you'll keep us in mind as a resource. And I look forward to hearing what people have to say today. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Linda. And lastly, on our panel here, we have Nicole Seltzer. I'm really excited, and I think Nicole and I have had many conversations over the years. I really appreciate your thoughts and being here today and jumping on this.
Good morning, everybody from beautiful Steamboat Springs. So my hope for the water plan update as it relates to some of the environmental and recreational goals is really kind of broadly two things. One, that it reviews the progress and the effectiveness of the recommended strategies that were in the prior water plan. And then secondly, that it lays out some new ideas on how to accelerate progress. Through the work that I have been doing at River Network, I've worked alongside Colorado communities to initiate more than 10 stream management plans to date. And so kind of through that lens, I have a few ideas for consideration that build on some of the stuff that you've already heard this morning. Specifically, I'd like to see the water plan update expand the use of stream management plans as a strategy to meet local and environmental and recreational goals, especially river health as it relates to flow, riparian corridors, fishery quality, and quality of the recreational experience. CWCB and River Network have been doing a lot in the last few years to try to lay out best practices and recommendations for how to undertake stream management plans. And there are over 25 that are completed or in process so far. If you haven't taken a look at coloradosmp.org, I'm giving you a plug to do so. It's a great compendium of recommendations and ideas on how to make those processes be effective. But 25 of those stream management planning processes in the state doesn't get us anywhere near the 80% goal that was in the original water plan by 2030. And part of that, I think, is because there hasn't been strong guidance on what it means to locally prioritize a basin for stream management plans. And so I'm hoping that the water plan update can help create that guidance and perhaps do that by giving basin roundtables a process that they are expected to follow to begin to prioritize the stream reaches in their basin to develop ENR recommendations on. So kind of in that vein, I do want to take a minute and plug the current BIP update process. I think that the current BIP update process, where they're developing project lists and updating project lists, it's a great opportunity for the basin roundtables to review which stream segments or subbasins already have watershed plans or stream management plans, and which ones are a priority to complete. So I would really encourage all of the Basin Roundtable environmental and recreational members to make sure that they try to elevate the prioritization of stream reaches for stream management plans in the BIP updates and identify some high priority reaches, because I think that will ultimately feed into the water plan update in terms of strategies and recommendations. Secondly, this idea of calculating an environmental flow gap statewide and Abby's idea of recommending a statewide rapid river health assessment. I'd really like to see the water plan recommend collection of river data at a finer scale. There are some landscape level tools that can help with understanding certain aspects of river health. For example, up here in the Yampa, we're actually just kicking off the use of remote sensing and satellite data to help us understand certain aspects of the river and refine our goals and set priority reaches. So that landscape level data can be helpful for that. But current statewide data tools and sources are really not suited to understand reach scale environmental conditions. And this is really true of flow measurement and modeling. Our gauging and water measurement system has primarily been set up to administer water rights. It was not set up to monitor environmental conditions on the river or set goals for environmental flows. And so in places with a lot of small diversions, like where I live in the Yampa, daily hydrology data is not really robust enough to truly understand what's going on. So I would love to see in the water plan update an analysis on the adequacy of our gauging and hydrology modeling tools at at the state from an environmental standpoint. I think that would be a really big win. I'd also encourage a discussion of how other agencies' data can be useful or might be lacking in the development of environmental and recreational targets. So for example, the Colorado Natural Heritage Program has a watershed planning toolbox, and it's prioritized creating data sets on wetland function and priority conservation and restoration areas in the Arkansas and the South Platte headwaters areas. But this kind of information is needed statewide. And so how can we help other state agencies make headway on that? And likewise, some basins have found the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Fisheries data difficult to obtain and not necessarily in formats that are really conducive to easy analysis. So how can we take a look at those data sets and make some recommendations on making them easier to plug in? Data collection is a core function of several state agencies. So this is definitely within the state's wheelhouse. And I don't think that communities necessarily should have to apply for grants and come up with 50% matching funds to collect data on the state of their rivers. So the last point I would like to make is to think a little bit about how the water plan can create tools that support local watershed organizations. If you were listening to yesterday's session on agriculture, Cindy Lair at the State Conservation Board mentioned that conservation districts have started to get involved in stream management plans and integrated water management plans. And on a separate call right after that, I've been Zooming a lot with the River District, American Rivers, and Colorado Cattlemen's Association. Faye Hartman with American Rivers encouraged people to get involved in their local watershed groups to strengthen the health of their local rivers. River Network in the last couple of years has provided almost $80,000 in grants to conservation districts for their staff time, technical analysis, and engagement of irrigators in stream management plans in 4 basins. It's reaping really great rewards to help combine the interests of agriculture with environmental and rec interests. And likewise, a lot of these stream management planning efforts are led by local watershed NGOs. They're the driving force behind a lot of the watershed restoration that's happening. So they can be important local partners, and I'd encourage the water plan update to think about their role in both agricultural infrastructure, watershed health, and river health, and how the state can maybe better support their operations. Many are severely underfunded. We have a few stellar examples of strong watershed organization and conservation districts in the state. But I think, for example, we could develop a partnership with the Department of Ag to help support conservation districts with additional resources. So I want to close by reminding everybody that addressing environmental and recreational needs doesn't need to be done in a vacuum. One example of that is that groups in the Rio Grande, the Yampa, the Middle Colorado, the Big Thompson, and several more are all folding assessments of the functionality of diversion infrastructure into their stream management plans. So it's a planning program focused on environmental and recreational uses, but they're folding in the needs of agriculture and the functionality of existing infrastructure into those. And so I do think that there's ways to prioritize the needs of agriculture as well as M&I users while also thinking about environmental and recreational opportunities. And we don't need to think about these as either or. And so with that, I am really looking forward to hearing all the questions that everybody has.
Great, thank you so much. And there are quite a few questions, and some of them tend to, I think, get grouped together. And I imagine maybe some of these first ones are things that perhaps, Matt, I will kind of see if you can pop back up and we can try to go through a few of these or group them. And maybe it's the kind of thing we could get the panel's input on. I'm reminded of just how important it is to kind of explain and explain our process, where we've been and where we're headed and how things were framed up. And for those who haven't seen the analysis and technical update, I would definitely encourage you to go there. It's the first update where we included at a statewide level climate change across at least 3 of the 5 scenarios. Certainly in that 5th scenario, a much higher level of climate change. It's the first where we've developed this flow tool that you've heard about here a bit, and we can certainly, I think we could probably post a link to that. That's also up on the Water Plan website. You can play around with that, and it may be something that we even want to think about how we potentially come up with a version 2 of that, maybe through this process as we're working through the BIP updates and the water plan. But it certainly was the first where we really tried to put municipal uses, environmental uses, and agricultural uses on, we've kind of set it as equal footing, and understanding that there's not a truly a quote unquote gap defined. There's some concerns that we've even heard from the ag community of how helpful is the term gap, and do we need to be thinking of this in terms that, I've heard Abby and Aaron and Carrie, speak to, of just other terms around needs, and how would we frame this up in terms of coming up with, some kind of calculation or assessment that really addresses not just this kind of much more simple math, I think, on the ag and muni side for developing a gap, but that really gets to, I liked what Kerry said when he says, you're really looking at not just the water need, but when, where, the quantity, the quality, and how. And those pieces maybe are just not as suited for rolling up into a simple calculation. I know that some of the questions that have come out of a gap, environmental gap, have been framed up a bit of kind of getting to that equal footing in terms of promoting projects. And I guess it's something that maybe we didn't cover, but bears a pause here to talk about, is that we have really worked and certainly are doubling down on this effort to get better data across the board, and certainly on the environmental side, whether that's prioritizing watersheds or getting better flow data or getting better gauge data. I mean, that's all on the table. It's the kind of stuff we want to be looking into, and getting some recommendations around that. And many of the comments that the panel's spoken to, I think are on point of getting some help of how we frame that up and what it looks like. But I will say that our budget was built on the initial input that we got from stakeholders, and that really did not include this discussion. It wasn't something that really came up, and it certainly wasn't something that was looked at in the technical update beyond the advances that we had done. So developing this flow tool, trying to put things on equal footing, are all advancements. And I think the history of the statewide water supply initiative into the water plan, into the analysis and technical update to the water plan, are really about advancing and continuing to move the ball forward. And certainly that is our goal here, and where we can do that better, we want to do that. But we will have to ultimately work with the timeline and the budget we have. And then that doesn't mean things get left to the side. This concept of what gets teed up into a recommendation or an action is 100% on point, and absolutely the direction that we think we should be heading, and would love to kind of continue to collaborate on that with staff and stakeholders. The one concept I wanted to hit on, though, is as we're teeing up projects and thinking about how you maybe advocate for an environmental project, we are really thinking, as part of this data collection, that it's also inherently important that we get basins to prioritize their projects. And so as they prioritize projects, we've kind of come up with a matrix and framework of how to do that. And those calculations don't really speak to necessarily addressing the gap so much as they address multi-purpose, or they address the highest need for the basin. So a basin could come up with a priority one project that's environmental need, and put that right alongside the bucket of other priority one projects that they have, or tier one projects that are framed up around muni and ag. I think that's another way that we've tried to kind of build in some innovation that puts things on an equal footing. And maybe we'll kick this over to you, Matt, but I did want to also touch on that piece that I think is so critical, and many of the panelists noted, and I think it's come through the chat. Maybe I will just specifically thank, too, in the chat, Melinda Casson, Ken Newbecker, and Molly Mugglestone, who've kind of made these comments around, calculating a gap. This other piece around integrating plans, and I think most recently Richard had a comment here in the chat as well around integrating stream management plans and integrated water management plans and planning efforts. That's so critical, and it's something that we heard loud and clear when we were going through this kind of initial stakeholder process of, and actually I remember very well, Nicole Seltzer had some great comments of, we're doing all this great work, how does it integrate with the basin plans? How does that integrate with a water plan? And we need to not be so locked into just this one plan, and really think about how we're referencing the best parts or recommendations or goals of other plans that make logical sense to include. And I know I had some great conversations with Abby and Josh Kuhn, and this idea of, well, what if a stream management plan isn't completed by the time this cycle of this specific update is done? Well, we're going to fall out of time and sequence with any number of planning efforts, and we can't hold one thing up for the other, but it doesn't mean that we're limited in that way. In my mind, we can point to, hey, this project, this plan is going to be developed, and that's something that we should point to. And to the extent that we have, data, projects, pieces of these reports that are more in an online format, they're potentially easier to update. And those are the kind of things that we're thinking of. So Matt, jump in here and help me where I might have missed things, and then maybe we'll get the panel's thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I might build a little bit, Russ, on your concept of continuing to move forward and just kind of reflect on the evolutionary nature of SWASEs and kind of where we are now, and maybe focusing on the M&I gap as an example of that. When we started the SWASE analyses, the M&I gap was very focused on it was basically a project gap or a structural gap. We have future needs, and do we have enough projects to meet those future needs? But that, didn't necessarily consider climate change. It didn't account for the fact that potentially future proposed projects are relying on the same source of water. So how does that work itself out? And it didn't look at different hydrologic conditions. And so over time, we've introduced the planning scenarios which account for climate change. We've realized that we need models, water allocation models, to really assess how things may work, what kinds of shortages we may have under climate change scenarios. So we've sort of evolved through time on that M&I gap calculation, and we're continually making improvements and moving forward there. On the ENR side, we have this flow tool that looks at potential future risks, and we anticipate to environmental and rec attributes. We anticipate that roundtables could use that to evaluate risks in different parts of their basins, and then develop projects that could help mitigate that risk in a similar way that they could use gap calculations. There's a risk of having different levels of gap for municipal, for ag users under the different scenarios, and then we come up with projects that could potentially meet those gaps. So we could kind of use the tools that we have available to us today to make similar to have similar conversations and identify future projects. But if through time, if we feel like this flow tool is not answering all the questions that we have, then it would be good to have that conversation. How could we improve upon that? Do we have the data available to do more detailed calculations? Do we have the models to do more detailed calculations? Our models that we used for the technical update are on a monthly time step. So if we need daily time step models, what would it take to get to that point? And so really kind of, again, have this statewide conversation about how we would approach this.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and I think this touches too on a comment that Ian Roche put in the chat, but just explaining how CWCB will help basin roundtables determine ENR water needs and help with just effectively getting better data and prioritizing. I mean, I think that this effort, whether it's ENR, Muni, or Ag, is really an exercise in getting better data. I mean, you've heard it from all the panelists here, and we recognize it for both projects and then the inputs that are going into the models. It's critical. It's absolutely the way we're doing it. And the funding that we've been so fortunate to receive, again, through our board first and the legislature, that's going to allow this process to move forward and really support ultimately these projects, including environmental projects, is the process that we're in the midst of, and that is something that we're doing. I guess, we've talked about this with a few of you on the panel. I might pitch it to Abby. I mean, just straight face test. I want to be transparent here. We've talked about the challenges we've had in the budget, but I think we're in some ways saying the same thing, and I really appreciated the comments that many of you have made. I think, Abby, you talked about just an action item to have this rapid river health assessment. I'm looking at my scribbled notes. You guys all had a lot of great thoughts. I heard Nicole talk about reviewing strategies and new ideas. I mean, Abby, maybe start with you. What do you think? Are we on the same page here? You feel the process moving forward?
I do, and I'm specifically thinking back to how the Poudre River reported through their rapid river assessment, their health scorecard. And that has been such a useful tool, not only to galvanize and organize projects to remedy areas and reaches of the Poudre that need it, but it's also a community engagement tool that draws the local residents in to their river, to the connection of the river, their water supply, and to river health overall. And so there are precedents. There are certainly protocols out there that can be deployed with scientific rigor, but don't necessarily break the bank. And so I think that looks to be a deeper conversation, a deeper dive in how we could look at least helping basins to prioritize their rivers and streams in a scientific way so that they can also prioritize their projects going forward, their stream management plans, even potentially looking at a larger watershed health aspect, from these particular river rapid health assessment report outs. So I think that we're getting the good conversation going, and I look forward to what's going to come from it.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel have thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, Russ, this is Carrie. I had a couple things I wanted to say. I was listening to Matt and reading some of the chats about a need for improved measurement. We don't have gauging stations in the places we need them across the state. Barbara Vasquez brought that up, and I think that's a really good point. It's related to the use of the flow tool. The flow tool is a great tool if you have a node in a place that's useful. I think as we move forward, it's going to be important not just to refine our goals, but refine our priorities and dig into those places where we need to have a full-fledged USGS or DWR gauging station, and where we can, as Abby just alluded to, use different types of technologies that might not break the bank, but are best suited for gathering the data that we need and making decisions that we need. There's a lot of interesting water management tools that are being applied and in Colorado and the Western Slope, and one of them I can think of is related to the Black Canyon water right, where we have all this important SNOTEL data for the Blue Mesa group, the inflows to the Aspinall unit, and that's how we make decisions. And if we have those types of tools and we can hone in on where we know we have flow gaps and how we can react to those, perhaps we don't need full-fledged measurement stations, but some type of monitoring that reports back and is related to possibly SNOTEL or water supply, tools that can tell us how we should react in certain situations. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but certainly we do need to do a better job of monitoring flows and getting measurements where we can in real time as best as we can.
Yeah, and can I add to that just really quickly? It's not just useful for environmental and recreational purposes to really start to think about measurement and gauging. The conversations that have been happening around demand management, the state engineer's office, saying that this is going to be a real focus of theirs. I think there's multiple places where a focus on this and a bunch of resources spent on it would be very, very helpful. So I would definitely encourage us to not think about this just from an environmental perspective, but also to remember that in order to understand environmental conditions, we need to have on the ground data that's collected, on a daily basis in sometimes.
Great points. Thank you so much. Maybe that's a good segue. We will, just so people know, we probably are not, there are quite a few great questions coming in here from Juan and Rio. I might, there's one that's maybe easy to clear out. Will there be a glossary? Yes, and in the tech update, we do have a glossary of terms, so that's an easy one. But maybe queuing in on something that you just brought up, and I think this kind of is a bit of a thread across a comment that Betty Jean made, and then Josh Kuhn, I think, puts it here. But
sometimes it's suggested that municipal conservation efforts that allow more water to remain in rivers don't benefit ratepayers. I guess the question here is, what are your thoughts on that? No one. There has to be thoughts on this, and we don't have to go there. I guess it's just an interesting comment that's come up a few times. Aaron, did you have something to?
Well, I mean, it's a good and interesting question. I agree. It depends on how we're defining the benefit. It certainly increases the quality of life. It influences people moving to Colorado. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of us, you know, if you live in municipal areas, you want to be able to escape for the weekends, and you want to go places where you can ski, where you can boat, where there's a healthy environment. And that's true for, you know, water and rivers. It's true for the watershed health and forest conversation we talked about. It's hard, I think, to directly tie the benefit back. But if you look at home values in Colorado, I don't think that's just because people want to live in Denver. They want to live in Denver because of where it is and where it's located within Colorado. So it's tough, though, because it doesn't necessarily make it into the bottom line for the water utility. So I understand that disconnect, but absolutely. I mean, I think I know Governor Hickenlooper said it, and maybe he stole this from somebody else, but you know, we love Colorado because it's the mountains and the plains and Denver and all these things together, not just, you know, living in Denver in the middle of nothing. I mean, that's not why we live here. It's not just for the cities, it's for all of it together. So it's there. That's not a great economics answer, but I don't think anybody would argue that the value of the natural world is part of what is increasing rental and home values and creating all kinds of their own problems, but also benefits to the state of Colorado.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron. Thanks for, I knew that economics background would come in there. Thank you so much for your thoughts on that. We are in our final 3 minutes. And so again, I think I was going to note that we will be working to kind of download the full chat and respond to all the questions that have come in if they weren't addressed here specifically. I wanted to take the time just to thank the panel. The conversation has been great, and I'm glad that we got into some of these areas. I know some of them are kind of tricky, but that's the nature of water. All our conversations are a little bit tricky, and that's why they're so important to have. So thank you all for being here. Nicole, Abby, Aaron, Carrie, Linda, I really appreciate your time. I know some of our colleagues are on the phone and listening in as well, and I appreciate them being here, and they've got some great feedback in the chat that we will be sure to incorporate as well. Matt Lindberg, any final thoughts to wrap this up?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention and reiterate some of the ongoing opportunities for folks to participate in the process. Certainly, roundtables are going to be very focused on their basin implementation plans. They're in the formative stages of those basin implementation plans now, and they'll be over the next 6 months to a year having discussions that are going to identify projects, are going to identify strategies. And so I'd encourage folks to participate in your roundtable. If you're not on the roundtable, you can certainly attend roundtable meetings and talk with folks that are on the roundtable. We're going to be, as we move forward, gathering input, perhaps having sessions like this or similar to this, and of course, releasing draft versions of basin implementation plans and the water plan itself, and looking for comments. So please stay involved, and we're very interested to continue discussions like these.
Thanks so much. And again, to everybody that's on the webinar call today, thank you for attending. We will, I think this was discussed maybe before people jumped on, but we'll be looking for ways to roll up this information and these questions, make it available, and try to find some meaningful ways to kind of do some downloads of both where the process is at and input that we've received. So thanks for everybody's time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we will look forward to continuing the conversation with you moving forward.